Good afternoon and assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into this broadcast today. My name is Dr. Maha Hilal, and I am the author of Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. And with me today is Jehan Hakim, who I'm very lucky to have interviewed for this book. And Jehan shared her perspectives on the war on terror in the book and a lot about the work that she has been doing to tirelessly advocate and push back against the Saudi and US war in Yemen. So it's really an honor to be with you here today, Jehan, and thank you again for sharing your story in the book. And for those of you who haven't read the book yet, please do pick up a copy. You can find the book at Target, Barnes and Noble, Amazon if you're, feeling like supporting them. Of course, there's issues with that, but please do pick up a copy of the book. I'll drop a link in a minute and to read Jehan's story as well as several other Muslim Americans that I interviewed for this book. And just to give you sort of an overview of the book, it is a book that attempts to really capture what has happened in the last 2 decades of the war on terror. Of course, there's no book long enough that could adequately do this, but what I attempted to do is to look at three elements and three ways that Islamophobia has really been rooted and perpetuated and targeted against Muslims. So in the book, I look at the role of narrative, and this refers to the official narratives that criminalize and demonize Muslims. I also look at laws and policies that were developed under the guise of the war on terror, that again, specifically and disproportionately target Muslims. And then finally, I look at internalized Islamophobia as a function of the ways that Muslims are internalizing and absorbing negative and problematic narratives about Islam and Muslims, and how Muslim organizations, at least a handful of them, have responded to this ongoing climate of Islamophobia. And finally, sharing stories of 11 Muslim Americans with various experiences and very different stories in terms of how they've experienced the war on terror and what their identity has taught them, or has sort of how that has been part of the way that they have experienced the last 2 decades of the war on terror. I would invite you all to join the discussion and to engage with us in this podcast. You can use the hashtag innocent until proven Muslim. I'll also see comments from the various platforms: Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. So post any comments or questions there, and we'll hopefully get to some of those questions towards the end. So, Jehan, you have been a tireless advocate for the rights of Yemenis and for ending the war on Yemen. And, you have done this work for so long. And I'm wondering, because we have, kept talking about the war on terror, what does the war on terror mean to you? How would you define the war on terror, and how is it manifested in this war on Yemen?
Thank you so much, Maha. I'm really honored to share space with you. The war on terror, it really means to me systemic violent Islamophobia on a global mass scale. It has allowed for military intervention into many countries: Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, a lot of the other Arab and Muslim countries. So it's really, to me, feels like a war on Arabs and Muslims, and it really set the grounds for what we're seeing, the role of the U.S. now in the war on Yemen, since the U.S. is not actively does not have boots on the ground in Yemen, but they do sell arms to the coalition, who is striking Yemen and has been indiscriminately for over 7 years. We continuously support different dictators and corrupt leaders in other countries in order for the US to continue to have a strong political arm in these various countries. So the war on terror really feels like a war on my community, my faith, and my identity.
Yeah, that is, a lot of what I have written about in the book, and I know a lot of Muslims similarly experience and think the same about what the war on terror is. I know one of the things that we talked about in the course of your interview is this sort of this distinction that's often made between what's happening domestically and what's happening internationally. And one of the things you really talked about is, this idea of like not separating yourself from what's happening internationally, and the idea that, you're here in the United States able to advocate for, against war in Yemen and war in general, because of your citizenship, the privilege of citizenship. So, can you just talk a little bit about, why you think it's important to connect what's happening domestically and internationally, and really in that, talking about what is our role as Muslim Americans, and what responsibilities do we have because of what we've been afforded vis-a-vis citizenship?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And it's really important as we're trying to advocate and push legislation as we speak right now. I think we need to stop divorcing ourselves from what is happening globally. Because I think whether we realize it or acknowledge it or not, the US is actively supporting endless wars in various countries. The drone warfare program that's been in place ever since the Bush era is still actively droning people in Yemen and Pakistan and different areas. Um, so those are U.S. unmanned warplanes that are targeting civilians. And civilians are the most impacted by all of these aerial bombardment. No matter how advanced our technology is with intelligence sharing and targeting assistance and all of that, we civilians continue to be impacted and massacred by all of these U.S. made equipment. So that's something that we have to make clear that the U.S. is actively involved in many endless wars happening across the globe. So I think that's something that once we remember that, then we can understand how connected we are because the Pentagon has the largest budget out annually. I mean, higher than healthcare, higher than transportation, higher than education. We fuel wars, and that's just the way this empire has not only incepted but also has been able to be maintained. War is a racket. It's there's large revenue that comes from our role in making sure that folks, that are actually, manning these warplanes or dropping these bombs. Um, there's a transaction relationship there. So we are most definitely involved. Our tax dollars are funding this. And if we remember, that's before my time, but if folks remember the war in Vietnam and the outrage, the international outrage that took place after seeing images coming out from reporters that reported on the just mass violence, the inhumanity, and the brutality. Americans stood up and they said, "Not in my name, and we're not going to pay for it." So I think it's what's happening in Yemen. And for example, what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in other areas, um, it's all part of this, global empire that wants to expand and make sure that they have a say in the political affairs in other countries. So why do they do that? That's a different question for a different day. I don't know if we can understand the moral compass of why, imperialism exists and with the use of militarism, with this mass violence. But we do know that this exists, and every American, whether you are Yemeni American advocating for Yemen, you can be Cuban American. We have allies from Cuba, or Cuban American, rather, I should say, Italian Americans that understand the role of the US and how it continues to exacerbate wars in their homelands. And we just have to stop separating ourselves. And anyone can be an advocate in ending the war in Yemen, whether you're Arab American, Muslim American, or from any other ethnicity. But I think it's especially important for Muslim Americans because we do have this one faith where we believe that um, if the body, we have to imagine ourselves as if we're one body, um, as an ummah, right? And then if
Right.
one part of the body is harmed, then the whole body feels it. And if we continue to move in this way as an ummah, then we would end the occupation of Israel of Palestine,
Mhm.
and arms sales to Israel, and the annual huge funding that goes to ensure that the apartheid state is able to conquest and settle and just expand in Palestine and in Yemen and in elsewhere. So it would not be something that we would shy away from, that we would be publicly and vocally speaking against all of these forms of oppression, from Yemen to Palestine to Ferguson. This is something that is an obligation as Muslims that we have to speak up and fight against injustice everywhere and condemn it everywhere, right? Even as we're thinking about what's happening to the people of Ukraine right now. So it's not really a duty that I feel that because it's my nationality or my family is from there, although that does make a difference. Obviously, I have family there, and I hear their stories, and I hear how the erasure of their stories. Actually I don't hear of their stories in the media and mass media and mainstream media. There is a complete erasure of their story and a very like a twist in the narrative, and really like America absolving itself from its role in the war on Yemen, which is why I more so feel the obligation of trying to uplift and amplify the voices of Yemenis. But I do that for also for the lives of Palestinians. I do that for the lives of our African American brothers and sisters as well. And I'm just reminding it Muslims that is an obligation on all of us to make sure that we are using our this citizenship that that we have, right? That
Mhm.
a lot of our brothers and sisters escaped and fled countries, and some of them even died on their way to come here. And while we know that the US is also responsible for creating refugees in the first place, we know that for those of us here, that we do have an advantage, and we have to, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, use it in order to try to relieve some of the injustices that our country, our tax dollars are responsible for.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jan. That was very, really powerful. And, I think, one thing we touched on in the book is, it's not just about Muslims, not caring, that there is oftentimes active participation from Muslims, right, in the injustices that are being inflicted on other Muslims. And so really just thinking about, not just our responsibility to work towards justice, but also to specifically address and confront what internalized Islamophobia looks like in our community and how it's showing up, because it is harmful to our community and unfortunately is a consequence of institutionalized Islamophobia. So I'm really glad you talked about that and brought it up. And I see, the poster. I just noticed the poster you have in the background. And for those of you who can't see it, it says "Banned, Bombed, Forgotten Yemen," and that's a really depressing yet I think accurate picture of what has happened to Yemen. And I know that you brought up Ukraine, and one of the things that people have kept pointing out on social media, right, is the double standards and the ways in which people are actually expressly, recognizing the humanity of Ukrainians, right, and celebrating Ukrainian resistance in a way that we know, right, would never ever be applied or happen to, folks in Yemen and, in countries all over the globe, Pakistan, Somalia, right, wherever the United States happens to be intervening in. So I'm wondering, with that, with sort of this ongoing now like active war and wanting to show solidarity with Ukrainians, but at the same time, really highlighting the ways in which, Muslims have been so dehumanized that this sort of a reaction has never really been part of the way the war on terror been responded to. What are some of the ways we can intervene in these, very clearly observable double standards when it comes to, for example, Ukraine versus Yemen?
Yeah, it's been really painful to watch the last few days, painful from many ends. So it's painful to watch the people of Ukraine fleeing their homes and their structures being demolished. Looking at some parts of Ukraine, it's almost like looking at Yemen or Palestine or Palestine or even Afghanistan. So
Right.
I stand in solidarity with all of those who are impacted by violence, the innocent ones, obviously, those who are have had no say with what's happening in their physical geography. At the same time, I think that yes, mainstream media is really spotlighting Ukraine and Russia right now, and the double standards are so stark. I mean, we have seen reporters on a daily basis talk about that these are civilized Europeans. They are Christian. They're white people with blonde hair. And, I don't think we need to look at what someone looks like as they're escaping an intervention or an airstrike or fleeing, and I don't hear anyone being called a rebel or a terrorist either on either side. You know what I'm saying? I think, you know, language causes war. So I think what we're seeing here is there's a humanizing that's happening, which is great. I think people that are fleeing wars are are having to live under suffering, such suffering should be humanized. But I think that all humans that are suffering from intervention and violence should also be humanized. Like if we're going to condemn war, the war on Ukraine, then we need to condemn the war on Yemen. Then we need to condemn the war on Afghanistan. Then we need to condemn the invasion of Iraq, that we need to condemn the role of Israel, occupying and committing genocide on the Palestinians. Like
Right.
that's where the difference is, and I think it's hard to ignore that there is a very stark and clear, glaring double standard, and it's you know um, white supremacy still exists, right? I think that's a reality, and we're seeing it on a global level too. It's not just here in the states. Why is it that when a child has blue eyes, that they're suffering more than a brown skinned child with brown eyes? Why is that? I think we have to ask ourselves, why is the media spotlighting the identity of the victims of this war? And why is that not offered or afforded to brown people or Muslims or Arabs? So I think you know, what we can do is, shift the narrative. Continue to lift up the oppression that's happening everywhere. Yes, to condemning the war on Ukraine, but yes, also to condemning the war on Yemen, to condemning wars everywhere. Like we have to make sure that we are using language that is humanizing our people as well. That when you were talking about internalized Islamophobia and something that we Muslims at times are guilty of, we need to check ourselves. Are we perpetuating the same language that uh, the white supremacist machine is using? Like, don't share or retweet those things unless you're condemning it, unless you are wanting to call it out. But just I'm not sure like why we have to even discuss this. It's a clear problem. So I think I mean as Muslims and our allies, lift up the voices of those that are doing the work. Dr. Maha has been doing this work for ages. You know, retweet her stuff. Don't retweet NBC's or CNN's. I think retweet the language and the messaging of those who are impacted by the war on terror or endless wars. And I think that is a very easy way to get involved and really just try to intervene in these double standards?
It really is a lot, and it's always been really interesting how the United States, the only way it can intervene in conflicts, or the only way it can sort of fight its battles, right, is to use militarism and warfare. And along with this humanizing, one of the things that honestly bothers me about these narratives around humanization and dehumanization is the idea that, for example, Yemenis who have been clearly dehumanized, that it's on them to humanize themselves for those who are dehumanizing them. And, I wonder, I can see that you have thoughts on that, but I mean, it's just a very interesting dynamic, right? Because again, of course we should condemn war, and we do condemn war no matter where it happens. But in the case of Ukraine, I mean, the media, we know, is being proactive about humanizing Ukrainians, whereas when it's when Muslims and different Arabs are being dehumanized, the burden then shifts instead to the dehumanized to correct the narratives about them. And I'm just wondering from you, like, what does that feel like? And really, like, how do we really push back against it? Because it is a lot of labor, especially when that's also happening simultaneously to actually being targeted.
That's a big one. I don't know the answer how to do that, to be honest with you, because I've tried for many years. Because, like, if we look at this, for example, if we look at what's happening in Ukraine, visually, there are airstrikes that we are seeing, there are demolished structures, and then there are people fleeing. Those are normal. Unfortunately, it's a normal landscape to look at when we're thinking about war. But when you look at, for example, Palestine or Yemen, what do you see? I know from what I've seen over the last so the U.S. intervened into the war on Yemen almost 7 years ago. So next March will be 7 years. So for almost 7 years, and even before that, I see Yemenis in carrying arms. I see them chanting. I see them looking violent, and I don't hardly see anything that humanizes them. So it's really hard to humanize Yemenis while the media is doing their part in dehumanizing them. Even in articles where I am speaking on the impact and I am speaking on the role of the US, guess what is on the cover? It's not a picture of a starving child, because every 75 seconds a child dies in Yemen due to hunger and starvation. Every 75 seconds. That's a minute and 15 seconds. You don't see a child that's starving. You don't see Amal that almost died at the age of 7, weighing just 10 pounds. You
Mhm.
see Yemeni men looking brutal and uncivilized and carrying arms. Um, so I think it's been really a challenge to spotlight the role of militarism and U.S. sponsored genocide in Yemen and elsewhere, while the media is really doing its part to just be counterproductive. You know, it's like, well, you're using my talking points, but you're not using a picture that really humanizes my community. So it's definitely been a challenge, but I think the beauty of social media is that uh, we're all given the opportunity and the leverage to be agents of change. So I encourage everyone, when you are speaking of Yemen or Palestine or any of these other non-white people that are impacted by violence, especially that's sponsored by our tax dollars, just please use messaging and visuals that are by people that lead or countries, by the organizations that are from those countries. You know what I'm saying? Like people that are impacted by this violence and that are really actively working to fight against it. So don't go to the, you know, big humanitarian agencies that are getting whopping billions of dollars of funding. Go to those of us who are grassroots, who have connections to our people, who hear their stories that CNN and mainstream news won't cover. And I think this is an easy way for us to, you know, sort of do a little bit of damage control, even though it's extremely laborious to continuously talk about, because even the idea of humanizing and dehumanizing, the idea of humanizing is dehumanizing itself. So, yeah, but I mean, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the interest of folks really wanting to um, do the work the right way, and I think following the lead of folks impacted is the right way.
Wow, that's really powerful, Jehan. The last sentence you said, especially the work of what is it? The work of dehumanizing? No,
Yeah,
sorry.
the work of so the work of humanizing is dehumanizing.
The work of humanizing is dehumanizing. Yeah. That's yeah. I don't think I could have said it any better myself. So thank you for that. I think the last question maybe I want to ask you is, how can folks get involved in the work to challenge the war on Yemen and to really push back against this protracted violence that Yemenis have been subjected to for way too long at this point? What can we do here and now? And I know you talked a little bit earlier about some things, but how do they get involved with your work specifically and just pushing back against this war on Yemen?
Thank you so much, Maha. Before I get into that, I wanted to name something that I forgot to name earlier. Because I think sometimes when we don't name things, then they go, they get concealed. There's no accountability. When Muslims internalize Islamophobia, they engage in CVE programs.
Mm,
CVE programs are called countering violent extremism, which is the name itself is Islamophobic. But there are some Muslim organizations who get funding from the government to counter violent extremism, which is really a blanket to disguise monitoring, surveillance, all types of behavior that are inherently Islamophobic. So I wanted to just caution people, especially those who are in Muslim organizations, to not subscribe to any of these type of funding. It's not worth it. We are perpetuating Islamophobia when we engage in these tactics. So let's just kind of do away with those behaviors. I think they were something that some of the Muslims engaged in after the war on terror, when there's a lot of fear and hysteria. But let's move away from relying on a government that perpetuates Islamophobia here and abroad. Um, but what folks can do to get involved in the war on Yemen, or to get involved in ending the role of the US in the war on Yemen. So tomorrow, March 1st, is the National Day of Action, or National Week of Action, I should say, where there are protests all around the country. Folks are going to protest at their legislator's office. We are pushing for another war powers resolution. We did this back in 2018 and it succeeded in 2019, but Trump vetoed it. Essentially, the War Powers Resolution is a piece of legislation that will, um, you know, uh, not continue to give the president a blank check into all of these interventions that take place. So it's not repealing the AUMF, which is a separate long advocacy that we're all working on. It will not end the drone warfares, unfortunately, but for this intervention that was not authorized by Congress in 2015, it's illegal for the U.S. to be involved in what's happening in Yemen. So we're calling on folks to protest at their lawmakers' offices this week or even this month, because, like I said, March marks the 7th year since the U.S. Intervened into the war on Yemen, selling arms, equipment, and intelligence sharing, and also upholding the blockade, which has caused a famine. So we're calling on folks, like I said, to go to legislators' office, protest, and then if you're unable to go out into um, the world, I know COVID still exists, you're able to do things online. So we have a social media toolkit where this whole entire week we're going to be just sharing different talking points and messaging. And you can even call. We have a hotline where
mm,
you call 1-833-STOP-WAR. You call this number, you put in your zip code, then you'll be automatically sent over to your lawmaker's office, and then you leave them a message. Essentially, we're wanting to know, why is the U.S. continuously supporting the genocide on the people of Yemen, and that it's illegal and that it needs to stop. And I think it's hopefully it's an easy ask, but folks can feel free to follow me on Twitter or reach out, and we can help if these ways are not really feasible for folks to get involved.
Thank you so much, Jehan. And of course, I'll share your the toolkit and the week of actions on social medias for anyone tuning in. I think I was gonna leave it at that, but I wanted to actually ask you one more question because the State of the Union is going to be happening tomorrow, and I wanted to know if you had any, if you had any expectations about whether or not Biden would address the war on Yemen, and or how, if you think he might, what do you think he'll actually say?
I do not think that he is going to address the war on Yemen in a way that is meaningful.
Mhm.
I think he has no choice, you know, because of his foreign policy advisors to talk about what's happening in Yemen. I think what we've heard from Biden last year, which is we're going to end the war on Yemen, compared to this year that we're going to defend Saudi Arabia's borders. I think we're going to hear more of that, more of defending Saudi Arabia's borders. Him and um, Blinken are talking about wanting to designate the Houthis in Yemen as a foreign terrorist organization, which means that funding is going to be cut off into Yemen, means more civilian starvation. So I doubt that he's going to be addressing Yemen in a meaningful way. But if folks have connections, please call on his advisors to. Um, this is a mistake. Obviously, the Biden administration is making a huge mistake, just like Bush did in Afghanistan. So history is writing everything that this administration is doing, and it's looking like he is backtracking, backpedaling, and going back to the Obama era. The war profiteering legacy. I'm sure we'll hear a lot about Ukraine, which is important. We should hear about those who are impacted by war, but I am not holding my breath and wondering if Biden is going to address Yemen in a meaningful way, unfortunately.
Well, please do follow Jihan on social media. Her Twitter handle is at Jehan, Jehan_Hakim, Hakim, for her incredible analysis and work on Yemen. Obviously, now is always the time to push back against war, and especially a war that has gone on for so long and has caused so much pain and suffering to the Yemeni people. So, thank you so much, Jihan, for taking the time to speak with me, and for all of your wisdom, your perspective, and your brilliance in the book, and in our conversation today. I'm just really grateful to know you, and to be your friend and to work alongside you in social justice.
Thank you so much, Maha. Thank you to all the listeners, and go get Maha's book now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.